So, welcome this evening. I'm Kevin Harrison. I'm a farm manager down near Bath. I'm also chair of SCOPS and chair of the NSA English Committee. And welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is aimed at enlightening you and answering many questions you might have on how you can ensure and test that our wormers are working correctly. It's worth saying a lot of this has been born out of the English animal health and welfare pathway, where DEFRA have decided to put testing anthelmintics efficiency within that vet review, and we're not really focusing just on that today. We're trying to involve all nations, and this can be done by anyone from any nation within the UK, and the kits and that can go wherever you like. The only difference is that it is perhaps not funded. I will also say that we are only the messenger. We're doing this to help you understand the worming treatment check and how to get the most out of it. If there's any criticisms or anything about the pathway, then please send them DEFRA's way and not sort of hog the question and answers about that tonight for us. With regards to questions and chat, if you can keep the chat for idle chit chat, and if you are AMTRA or VetPol or Rosa registered, then if you put your number in there, then we can capture it, and then you can get your points. But you will be asked at the end to put it in again, so we know you've been through it. And I'll also ask you how many ties I've worn tonight, so that we can tell you've been watching all the way through. And then questions, if you could put them in the Q&A section, and then we can pick them up easier and keep the tabs of them. And we do have a great lineup of speakers tonight. Both speakers today champion what's right in the sheep industry, especially in animal health and welfare. Their solid understanding of the sheep sector has earned them the respect of their peers and everyone in the industry, from farmers to government. Rebecca is a senior veterinary advisor at BioBest, where she offers advice and expertise across the board on ruminants. She has been president of the SVS and also been a veterinary investigation officer. She is an RCVS advanced practitioner in sheep health and production. Leslie's an independent sheep consultant and has been a leading figure in the sheep industry for over 40 years, founder of SCOPS, and has been active for over 20 years. She's a solid source of advice on sheep, from nutrition to parasites. And tonight's webinar is going to be put into 4 sections. So the first one is which group of sheep to use and when to test. There's a few myths about, what sheep you can test and what time, why you can't do certain ones. And then on 2, we have what do you need to carry out the test. So there are kits out there available, and there's special laboratories which have come up with really precise testing so that we can get definitive answers on this. So what you need, kits, and how you get them posted and things like that. And then 3 is how to collect good samples and get a reliable test result. Very important that you do all the sections right and get it through. And then 4 is interpreting the results and what's next, because it's all very well working out that a wormer treatment hasn't worked, but what it can cause the concerns, and then where you go after that. Get your questions in for each section as we go. I mean, if you type one in about any other section that whilst you think of it, then we'll try and pick it up later on. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and put yours in, and then it saves me having to ask mine, and you won't get fed up with my voice. So I'll hand over to you, Leslie, first, I think.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So yeah, as Kevin says, we've split this up into 4, and we don't really want to be talking to all the slides all night long. So it's very much an opportunity for you to ask your questions. Hopefully we'll tick a few off as we go, but equally do put them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up and try and answer them as we go along. So the first thing to say is that really, you know, all of this is designed, and what we really want to do tonight to make sure that you get good information when you do a test. There's no point in going to the trouble of doing a test and half-heartedly doing it and getting poor information, which at best is pretty useless. At worst could be quite dangerous, because it could mean that you think a wormer group isn't working when it is, or vice versa, and then that affects decision making. So really what all this is about is for you to get the absolute most out of, whether you're doing the worming treatment check for the pathway, or whether, you know, you're outside of that and you want to do a good check for yourself. The principles are exactly the same. So in the first section then, I just really want to start off with just making sure we're all on the same page in terms of what it is we're actually measuring. Now, I mean, Rebecca will come in as we go through, and she's got a lot of experience building now in terms of perhaps some of the mistakes that people have made so far, some of the misunderstandings, as Kevin said. So just really to recap quickly for you to start with what it is we're measuring. So what you've got in front of you there is a stylized life cycle, which would apply to the Strongyle type worms. You can see there that, you know, we've got the eggs there in the dung, and those hatching through, becoming infective larvae on the pasture, time-wise 2 to 12 weeks, and then the sheep ingesting those, and then those having to then develop into adult egg-laying worms. Now, when we're doing this test, what we are looking at are effectively an indication of the number of adult worms in the sheep by counting how many eggs are there. So very important. I mean, some people get a bit mixed up, I think, sometimes, in that we talk about resistance, and sometimes we talk about resistant sheep because sheep can have a very high acquired immune level that's genetically linked, but it's not the sheep that are resistant. What we're looking for is to be able to measure, when we treat a sheep, how many of those worms inside that sheep has that treatment actually killed. And so it's the adults, and that's where the eggs are. And it's really important then that we get an accurate count of those eggs, and that we also, as we go through this, you'll see, we also stick to the timings between the sample that we take at the start and the second sample, which is what we then work out from that, what the reduction has been. So really important then that we get that right, and have that in your mind, that you're going to treat that sheep. It's going to kill, hopefully, the majority of the worms there, but if there's a resistance, or if there are problems with the treatment, as Rebecca will come on to later, then we need to make sure we can accurately measure the difference 7 or 14 days later. So if, I can see there that there's one question coming already. I'll just have a quick look.
There's probably one for later.
You think it probably is? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. So that's just so we're all on the same page as to what we're actually measuring. So do put any questions in there on that you want. Okay. So just as a diagrammatic and pictures what we're actually doing, just to sort of recap on this for you. And you'll notice that that's a lamb there. And I'll come on to in a minute why we would not just suggest, but really try and insist that you just do this test on lambs. But we'll come to explain that in a bit more detail in a minute. But we've got our lamb there. I've got 10 squiggly worms, just so that that's 100% and 10, and 10 worms. We're not going to go and actually count that. And of those, I've said 10% of them are resistant. So the 1 in 10 is resistant. If we do our count at the start, then we're going to get hopefully a nice round number, around about 500 eggs per gram. It's important that that number is high enough for you to do this. 2 reasons. One is you want it to be high enough to justify treatment anyway. The last thing we want you to be doing is treating unnecessarily. And secondly, obviously, in terms of the accuracy of the reduction, if we get a decent count, then we get a much better view of what the percentage reduction is going to be. So we've got a high enough count. We would say, I mean, Rebecca, or I think normally, you know, we're looking at around about 250 as the absolute minimum. Different labs will have different minimums. They can advise you, but thereabouts is where that's going to be. So then you're going to drench, okay? And we'll come back to that again, because that drenching needs to be really accurate as you can make it, because what we don't want is for you to be measuring how poor the dose rate was or how poor the technique was. And then what happens is, if that has all gone well and the right dose rate at the right time, the right way, all that will be left in that sheep will be that 10% of resistant worms, as represented by that one worm there. And so when we go back in 7 or 14 days to sample again, 7 days for a yellow wormer, 14 days for everything else, we will pick up 50 eggs per gram, thereabouts, and we should have a 90% reduction. And Rebecca will talk more about what the percentages actually mean at the end. But that is what we're actually measuring. So the important things are: have a count in the first place, and that means do a bit of monitoring first. Don't just start the test any old time and expect to have, you know, to be able to have a high enough egg count. Again, we can come back to that. Drench properly, wait the right number of days, retest, and then you get a measure of how many of those worms are left alive in that animal. So the next question we get is when? When's the best time to start this test? Now, quite a few people, obviously the labs have had samples in, so quite a few people were keen, and we like people to be keen, and they got going on this really early this spring. But unfortunately, has been unlikely to result in really good results for most people, because as you can see from this diagram here, what you've got there is over the year the amount of larvae on pasture, the green, and the amount of eggs that the animals are putting out there, the eggs from the lambs particularly in the summer. And you can see that for us to get a reasonably high count, we really do want to be in this June, July, August through to September is a good time. So now, and the reason why we're doing this webinar now is a really good time to be thinking about having that high enough count in the lambs, A, to warrant treatment, and B, to get a good test. So, you know, that's the sort of period. If you go too early and the counts are too low, if you're coming in this sort of area here, particularly where this year we have had in some parts of the country a very, very dry, hot time, a lot of the counts have been too low, and people have been drenching unnecessarily, or not finding. And I think, Kevin, you're in that position, aren't you? You've been waiting for your FET count to go up.
Yeah, no, I'm still waiting now. Obviously they had their Nematodirus drench a long time ago now, and it has been so dry. I mean, we've had a bit of rain now, but they're still not going up. Can you just sort of clarify for everyone just that little bit of difference between the Nematodirus treatment that we do early on, you know, April, May, when we were watching the forecast, and why you don't do it there, and why you do it now is the best time? I know your diagram there is a great reason why, but there are a lot of Nematodirus eggs around, aren't there?
Yeah, and if you were to superimpose the Nematodirus on that, of course, the Nematodirus isn't really in there. That's would shift a little bit to the left. So within this test, certainly some people might want to test for Nematodirus as a separate issue, but certainly for the worming treatment check, that is aimed at us doing this measurement on the main genera of worms, the strongyles, and we'll show you the differences there towards the end of the webinar. We'll talk about the differences of those. Now, the issue with the Nematodirus is that in terms of resistance, we know that there are a few farms in the UK where Nematodirus has been shown to be resistant to the white drenches, but it's still only very much the exception, not the rule. I've certainly been checking taking it on a lot of my clients' farms for years, and I've never seen a problem on any of my clients' farms. But I know Rebecca's worked in the area where they found those cases, so they certainly do exist. But the issue really is that, so Nematodirus isn't the target species. Rebecca will show you, they will report on that, but it's not the target species, and we want to avoid that. And of course, that's the one that's coming in the spring. We want to target this at Strongars. And the other,
Siobhan saying there that they worm at the highest Nematodirus level. I don't know if she means highest count or when it's the mass hatch, and she says, is that wrong? So maybe, I know it's slightly off piece, but whether you could just explain the best time to worm for Nematodirus and Strong.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, so I'll come to that. The only thing I was going to say was that when we actually do an effectiveness test for Nematodirus is a little bit of a monkey, because actually we tend to say we need to go in maybe 9 or 10 days, not the 7 or the 14. So that's just another reason. But so we want to shift. It's the Strongars that we're aiming for. So coming back to that question, with Nematodirus, the damage is done to lambs not by the adults; it's done to them by the immature larvae. And that's why we have the forecast, because if you wait until you've got a massive high count of Nematodirus, you may already have had dead animals. So Nematodirus, if it hatches gradually, lambs will acquire immunity to Nematodirus by the time they're 3 or 4 weeks of age. They're starting to develop that immunity. It's really quick compared to the other worms. But if we get a mass hatch, which the forecast is there to predict, then that helps people to go in and drench before you start to see a big increase in the egg count. So Nematodirus is the worm where egg counting is less applicable. It's really good to know in terms of contamination, but not in terms of timing of treatment. But that's a whole webinar on its own.
Yeah, two separate things to talk about really is the Nematodirus treatment early spring and the worm and treatment check.
Exactly. Okay.
Right,
So this is when, right? Okay. So the other question then is, why does it have to be lambs? Why not ewes? And this has been something I think that Rebecca, we've had to talk to a lot of people about this spring, isn't it? Because a lot of people have gone in and they have actually tested ewes. And I'm just put this graph in really to explain to you why not. And I think most of you will know, and I think the question in the chat there was about worming ewes, that adult sheep, when sheep by the time they're, their second grazing season, they do acquire a pretty good immunity to these main Strongyl worms. The Haemonchus is slightly different, but they do develop an immunity. And of course, the standard is that we expect that immunity to wane around about lambing, sometime just before, during, after lambing. And at that point, the ewe starts to pump out eggs, and that's contamination for the lambs. Now, the problem with then saying, well, I'm going to test my wormer on the ewes is in the graph in front of you. You can see this is one farm. This is 2 years worth of data, and lambing at the same time. The two graphs look very different. So if you were, for example, to have gone in and happened to have done your first test and got the 1,000 EPGs on that first very high peak, and then gone in 14 days later and done your reduction, well, the EPG's halved anyway. If you'd done it a bit later on, you'd have gone from 300 down to virtually nothing. So because the ewe is regaining her immunity, you can't do an effective test to say how much the worming has reduced the egg output, because the ewe herself is already beginning to regain it. So the ewe test is just not reliable. You couldn't say at what time you could do it reliably, because we know from a lot of work that we've been doing this last 3 or 4 years, every year is different, every farm is different. So you're not going to get a reliable test from ewes. End of story, really. And some people have found that they've really sort of wasted a bit of effort trying to do that. So that is one of the classic questions that we do get asked.
There's another question about lamb worming ewes, and I know that's slightly off piece to what we're here today, but just briefly, could you just sort of touch on why we
Oh,
don't
worming.
use
Well,
at turnout? Or
well,
anything
won't
like
use
that?
it turnout. I mean, the work that we've been doing, I mean, classically, most people would have wormed their ewes around and about lambing in that peri-parturient period, either just before or at, or just before before turnout. The work that we're doing these days, of course, is that we now know that not all ewes produce a lot of eggs, and we now know that how many eggs they actually, how much their immunity wanes, which allows them then to produce a lot of contamination, is linked to how well they're fed, and is linked very much to how good their body condition score is. And actually, the more recent work that I've been doing, the timing of that is also very much linked to when they're under the most nutritional stress. So where we are now is that we're saying to people, don't worm all your ewes routinely, only worm those ewes around lambing that have lost a lot of body condition, are under stress, and leave the rest of them untreated, because you're not getting the advantage, and you are risking increasing the speed that resistance develops. So
perhaps Joe could put a link on the Scops website into the worming
Yes.
news section then, or test our knowledge of the thing.
Yeah, that will be good.
We can-
Again, Siobhan, that's another webinar. Okay. Right. It's not moving on.
So I think if we were going to summarize that section, the basic summary is that you want to do the test in the animals where you're going to see the worst effects of a wormer treatment not working. So that's your lambs, where a wormer not working is going to affect your performance and growth rates of your lambs. And you need to do it when they've got a fecal worm egg count high enough for you to justify treatment, because that's also important for us to be able to measure the difference in the egg counts.
Right, excellent. I've stopped sharing now because we are at the video point, I think, Joe.
I can't type and put links in the chat and share the video.
Okay, well, don't worry, because there is one more slide actually I can put.
No, don't worry, because I'll stop typing and do that. It's no worries.
I can say a few words about what we've experienced
Yes.
so far at BioBest in terms of pathway submissions. So in terms of the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway, which launched in February, we did have a flurry of submissions then because people were keen, they got signed up. We did have what are really just a few teething problems where people maybe hadn't fully got their head around what was needed. And we certainly got people taking samples too early in the year, having not done an egg count to check what burden the worms had. And it was really too early, and the counts that we got were too low. Some of them had no eggs detected. And we did have submissions where people had done them in adult ewes. And again, when this was February, March time, it coincided roughly with lambing time. So all of that information that Leslie's demonstrated about the rise in egg counts around lambing time meant that that wasn't the best time to do them either. But we've also had some coming in the last few weeks where the counts have been good, decent counts, enough to justify treatment, and certainly enough to go ahead with your worming treatment check. And we've had other questions about, well, you know, I'm an early lambing flock. I get my lambs away really quickly off grass. I'm not going to have an egg count high enough, just as Kevin's finding at the moment his egg count's not high enough. What am I going to do in terms of testing in that situation? And what I've been saying to people, and we're all in agreement on this, is firstly, are you keeping female ewe lambs as replacements? You can always check egg counts in those as the season goes by, wait till it's high enough and use those as your group for doing the worming treatment check-in. Or in some cases where your egg count from a mob of lambs is not high enough, you may be able to have a subgroup of poorer, lighter lambs within a larger group, mark about 20 of those and use those lambs as the ones that you collect your samples from. Because as we know, with the way that worm egg counts are distributed throughout lambs in a group, you'll have some lambs within a group with a very high count, a lot of lambs with a very low count. But if you target the poorer performing lambs, you're skewing it, so you're more likely to be getting those lambs with higher counts. And then you can do your worming treatment check in a subgroup of a larger group where you might be able to find a high enough egg count to do it in those particular lambs.
I can't
I
believe
think-
we've reached the limits of Joe's capabilities.
But I think the other thing as well is to stress, isn't it, Rebecca, that, you know, some people are saying, or some people thinking, well, we'll do the first test and then we'll wait for it to come back and treat. That really does mess up the timings. Ideally, you want to be doing some monitoring for leg counting, know that you need to treat, and then on the day that you treat, start the check. That's the thing. You know, don't try and kill every bird with one stone. You much better chance of getting a good result if you do some monitoring first.
And important to make the point that although for the pathway testing, you do have to use one of these 3 approved labs for the actual testing, and we're going to talk about the kits in this next section. The checks that you do to monitor if your egg counts are high enough to then do the worm treatment check can be done by farmers themselves or through their usual vet or SQP or whoever does egg counting for them. You don't need to use an approved lab for that part. I think we're ready for the video.
No sound.
Yeah, we've got the same issue, Joe, no sound.
I'm doing it exactly the way that we did it in the practice. Just bear me 1 second.
I'll talk over this while we're hoping to get things sorted. So Kevin requested sampling kits from each of the 3 approved labs. So there's BioBest where I work, there's APHA at Carmarthen, and there's Techion, and all 3 of those labs have been approved by DEFRA to do the testing for pathway. And that basically means that we all are signed up to certain quality assurance schemes so that we can demonstrate that we're doing a very good protocol at a high level and that we're competent to do that. So that's why DEFRA have opted to go for these approved labs. And Kevin requested sampling kits from each of the labs just so he could demonstrate to you exactly what's in the boxes. Kevin, do you want to talk about what's in the boxes, or do you want me to do that?
I can do it.
Just give me a second and let me see if it'll work now.
Excellent.
No, it's not working. So basically, I've got the 3 kits, and there's the 3 there. You've got Techion, you've got BioBest there, and you've got AFA there. They all come in their own sort of pre-postage boxes, and with that AFA one, you just take off your address and the other labels underneath. It's stuck completely now, but you have to be careful with these boxes because they are all going to be used to send samples back.
So these are the 3 kits from the 3 laboratories that are taking part in the treatment check. We've got Techion, BioBest, and AFA. These came in a little box. These came in a plastic bag, and this came individually like this with my address on, and I just got to pull that off and send it back. Be very careful when opening these because they are prepaid boxes that you're going to send the samples back in, so just go careful as you open them. And well, let's have a look at the BioBest one first. So they came clearly labelled, so you've got pre-treatment test labelled and you've got post-treatment test labelled, so you can't make a mistake. If you open these, we're going steady, and in here we've got 15 sample bags. That's for individual samples. We're looking at a heat teaspoon, good 7 grams to 10 grams individual. The reason for that is if you might be used to doing pooled samples to your merchant or to your vet, but this is so that we can get it very accurate at the laboratory, so they can take their own measurements from each bag and get it much more accuracy. You've got a pair of gloves, they'll pick up the poo. There's some great videos out there on how to pick up the poo and do that correctly, so I'll leave that to those. And then you get a nice big bag to put your samples in to post back. And also, this is really good. This is a little bit of help on just steering your way through it, and a nice QR code to link you up to the Sustainable Control Parasites of Sheep Worm Treatment Check. And then the very important bit is the information, the pre-treatment check that you have to fill in. Farm name, farm email address, the sheep that you've sampled, what you've used. There's some questions there. It's very important that you fill all that in accurately and concisely to get the most out of the test. You can then put all that back in here. Put all your poo bags into the big bag to seal it up. I don't think they want the gloves back. And then the box then folds up nicely, he says. And then you can post it back off. And then do your second post-treatment check, which will be very similar inside. Obviously, depending on which product you use at the right time, and the paperwork will be slightly different in that one. That'll be about all.
Excellent, thanks Kevin. So as you can see, each lab's got their own sampling kits, and each lab may have their own system in terms of how you get hold of those. Certainly from our perspective, you can phone, I think it's the same for the other two labs as well, you can phone and request sampling kits, which will be dispatched out to either vets or farmers. Again, the different labs may have slightly different ways of sending these out. Some will send them only to vets, some will send them to vets or farmers, whoever requests them. But one of the really important things is to make sure that you follow the information that's in there so that you're doing the whole process correctly. Now, you don't have to use the sampling kits for the pathway testing if you don't want to. You can make up your own kits, but I know from the feedback that we've had, certainly people find them quite a help, because you've got everything that you need there then, and you know you're not going to go wrong. I think one of the things that we've learned so far is that there's a lot of information to get your head around in terms of the pathway vet review visits and the worming treatment check. And yes, obviously we'd like you all to read the guidance, read in full the user guide, which is on the Scots website, but we've also taken to including this information sheet, which is the one that Kevin brandished in the video there. If you read nothing else, if you read this, you're probably going to do a pretty good job. So it goes through 6 steps to make sure that you get the most out of it. And the first one, before you even start thinking about picking up poo, is to talk to your vet and decide which group of sheep you're going to use for the test. Lambs, not used as we've already said, and ones that have a worm burden so that you can justify treatment. And it's important to also mention for pathway that there's not a requirement for the vet to collect the samples. The farmer can collect the samples, and it may be that when you have your vet review visit as part of pathway, that's not the right time for you to do your egg counts and collecting your samples. You may agree on a later time after you've monitored some egg counts and it is the right time to do it. So it may not be the right time at the vet visit, but the vet doesn't have to collect the samples. And then you're collecting samples from 15 individual lambs. And it may be that some of you are more used to collecting 10, but the number 15 is not something that the labs have come up with. This is born from the science, which has told us that if you're going to do random sampling in mobs of lambs, 15 is a much better number to use. And we're collecting individual samples into the individual bags. About 7 pellets or a heaped teaspoon is what we normally say. That's usually sufficient from each lamb. And then squeezing the air out of the bag before you seal it, and then treat the group with the wormer that you're going to select for your worming treatment check. And that might be a wormer that you think is problematic and you don't have much confidence anymore, or it might be one that, if you wait until the autumn, is one that you normally use at that time of year, but you know you're having problems getting lambs away, so it would be a good time to try with that wormer then. But you know, it can be a discussion between your advisor and vet and farmer to decide which wormer to go with. And then the really important thing, as we've said, when it comes to dosing, is doing it correctly. So making sure that your wormer has been stored correctly before you use it, that you shake it, that you're calibrating your drench gun and your weigh scales, you're drenching to the heaviest in the group, your dosing technique over the back of the tongue is good, so the lambs aren't spitting it out. All of that needs to be done correctly, so that we know that when we give you the results from the lab, we don't need to worry about it actually being a reflection of things that have gone wrong on farm, and we're really just talking about which worms have survived the treatment. And then it's really important that the submission form is completed in full, and there's a lot of information on that submission form. It's there to help us at the labs, but it's also there to help farmers and their vets and advisors when they come to having the discussion afterwards in terms of what the results mean. You don't have to keep copies of the forms, because all of the information on the submission form is taken over into the laboratory report that you'll get. So it's all there, and you don't need to keep copies of the form to keep you right in future. But it is important that we have all of this filled in. I know we've had some forms recently which weren't fully filled in. We really need all of the information. We even still have a report waiting to go out where we don't even know which farmer or vet submitted it. So that's just waiting there. We don't know who to send that one out to. So if that's you, get in touch. But we do need all of that information. It's not there because we're trying to make your life difficult. It is all useful information that you will find useful when you're discussing with your advisor or vet at the end as well. I think if we go on to the next slide, please, Leslie.
Oh, well, if my PowerPoint would respond. Right, I think this is just me just reinforcing
Excellent,
that
yes.
bit, isn't it, about the and as Rebecca was saying, we come back to, and you'll see how Rebecca's lab uses that information in the report forms in the final section, which is really important. But this is just I think this is a nice example just to show you how quickly off course you can get with the dose and get a false result by underdosing. And of course, underdosing is also a major factor in the development of resistance. So there's two good reasons why you want to get it right. So weighing the animals, weighing to dosing to the heaviest in the group is the normal thing that we would say. If there's a big variation in weight within the group, then you could split them into 2 or 3. You know, if you've got a small number of animals, you might want to weigh them all individually. That's great. That's really accurate. But certainly, you know, there's 1 or 2 worms you have to be careful you don't overdose with. But if you've got a big spread, then you could split the group. So this group is going to be around about 45-50 kilos. So if this particular wormer, that means that we're going to go for the 50 kilos and we're going to go for 5 mils. But if, and I know Rebecca's got an example later on, someone's put in there that, well, I dosed to the average of that group would probably have meant that you would have picked 4 mil. So, you know, you would already be down by 1 mil. Having decided it's 5 mil, hopefully, you then need to calibrate the gun. And there's no point in thinking, well, I calibrated at the beginning of the season, or I even calibrated it yesterday when I started. You need to calibrate it every time you start. They do go off very quickly. And believe me, I've got the t-shirt. I've done demonstrations and started to do a demonstration, having just calibrated a gun and recalibrated it pretty quickly, because somebody will catch you out. Don't have to have a fancy calibration pot, just a big syringe, take the middle out, put your thumb on over the end, squirt 3 or 4 doses in there, one's not enough, just to work it up a bit so you can actually then see the level of accuracy when you've squirted 3 or 4 in there, and adjust the gun accordingly, and just do it regularly because they will go off. Then drench correctly. Get the drench gun over the back of the tongue, restrain the sheep properly. It's not an Olympic sport. And if you want a good result, then you really do need to get that right. Having done that, you should get a much more accurate result when you do get a better drench anyway, but get a better result as far as doing a worming treatment check is concerned. But I've just put a few numbers at the bottom just to show you how far off beam this can get very quickly. So if we'd just done the average of this group and we'd used 4 and not 5 mil, we're already only using 80% of the dose for quite a lot of the animals in the group. If the gun accuracy is out by 10% even, and 10% isn't a lot, guns are very often out by more than that, we'd then be down to 72% of the drench that they should have had. And then if we have another 10% loss, as Rebecca was saying, by them spitting it out or whatever, we can be down to 65%. And then instead of our lamb getting 5 mil, it's only getting 3 1/4 mils. And that is going to, A, not give you an effective return for your effort because you're not drenching them properly anyway. And B, your worming treatment check is going to give you a false result. So, just have that in mind, those simple steps. Do it all the time, but very definitely do it for the worming treatment check.
Leslie, Susie says she uses a syringe and squirts into the mouth. Is there any comments on that? Is that good?
Yeah, yes, quite interesting, that one, because when I first went out to Denmark about 20 years ago to go and do some work for them, they didn't know what a drench gun was because of small flocks, and everybody, there is an issue with that, Susie, because you do need to get that drench over the back of the tongue. If it stays in the mouth, then for some animals, what that can do is, because it's liquid in the mouth, it can actually trigger the esophageal groove. And what that does, of course, in a young ruminant is it snaps shut, and it's there designed to make milk bypass so that it doesn't actually get stuck in the room. We didn't want it in the room. The esophageal groove does that job for us. But in the context of wormers, what that means is most of these wormers, the groups 1s and 3s and so on, not group 2, but the others, they need to get there and they need that contact time because they need a longer retention. And so you're not going to get as good a kill. So you do need to be aware of that if you are, a drench gun is what you need to use. I don't know whether, Rebecca, you want to comment on that, but I certainly came across it a lot when I was over in Scandinavia.
And I think where you've got only small numbers of sheep, and you don't maybe have a drench gun, and they do need calibrating. You can get the syringes that have got the metal spout on them, which at least you can drench correctly into the back of the mouth, and the barrel is basically calibrated like a syringe, but they do have that spout, and that at least means that you are getting it right into the back of the mouth so that it's going to go where you want it to go. So that, I think I haven't done any tests to see how they are compared to drench guns, but the fact that they're calibrated like a syringe means that they don't go out of sync in terms of what measurements you're giving in the way that a drench gun with moving parts does. So that's an alternative, but it's how you manage to get it right to the back of the mouth that's really important.
That is the problem, isn't it? Yeah. Good point, though. Very good point.
Yeah, so just to carry on, this is one of the submissions that we had just this week, actually, which didn't have much information on it. So we know that we got 10 samples. We know from this the lambs are the right age, 4 to 6 months, and we know when the samples were collected, but we don't have any other details. So we don't know if they did the treatment on the same day as sampling, which is really important. We don't know anything in terms of the number in the group, so we can't check that they didn't make changes to the group between now and taking those post-treatment samples. And we don't have any other information which we would carry over and put in the lab report, which will help with the discussion. So it is important that we have a fully filled in form, not just so that we can get the results back to you. And from our perspective, we try and send the report out both to the farmer and to the vet at the same time if we have email details for both. Obviously, we can't do that unless we have those details provided to us. And I think the next slide. Right, so this is basically what you get after your first set of samples has been submitted. So you'll take your samples from 15, a minimum of 10, but preferably 15 lambs on the day of treatment, and you'll have filled in all of the information, and what you'll get back is a lab report. And the lab report goes to the vet and the farmer in the case of BioBest, and on there you will have your egg count, and your egg count will be in mainly 2 parts. So you'll have a Trichostrongyl type count, and then you'll have a count for Nematodiris batus and other Nematodiris. And as we've said, the reason that we have them differentiated is because these are the types that we can differentiate when we look down the microscope at the eggs. So we know that the Nematodiris type eggs look different to your Trichostrongyl type eggs. Trichostrongyl type eggs, we can't differentiate between lots of the different types. So the significant ones that will affect your growing lambs, like your Teledosargia, Trichostrongylus, Homuncus, we can't differentiate between those based on what the eggs look like. So we count them as one population of mixed species of Trichostrongyl type eggs. So what you're getting there is your count. The information is taken over from the submission form in terms of when you collected the samples, when you treated, what you treated with, and then you'll have a comment on how, whether the count is high, low, moderate. But most importantly, then you will have a sentence which tells you when you need to take your post-treatment samples based on what drug you've used. And the magic numbers are 7 days if you're using a yellow levamisole drench, and 14 days for any of the other classes of wormers that you might use. And one of the reasons that we send both the pre and post-treatment kits out at the same time is that if you're using levamisole, you've only got that 7 days. So by the time you've posted those to us, we've processed the samples, usually the day we receive them, and you've got the report back, which may be the following day. Then to get a kit out to you means that you might not have the kit in time. So from our perspective, we find it easier to send both kits out at the same time. And then the next slide will tell you what happens when we get your second set of samples. So different submission form, gathering slightly different information, this time focusing quite a lot on what wormer you used, and also focusing on how you did the drenching. So all of those really important things which we've already mentioned in terms of weighing the animals, calibrating your drench gun, all of that kind of information is all gathered at the time of collecting your post-treatment samples. And important to say that, again, you're collecting 15 samples. It doesn't have to be the same lambs that you're sampling at the time of treatment and at the appropriate interval after treatment. Because you're doing 15, as long as you're taking random lambs from the mob of lambs, you can take different lambs each time before and after treatment.
Mob has to stay the same, doesn't it, Rebecca? The mob needs to be the same. You don't want to be adding.
Don't be adding animals, because then you might sample the wrong animals. Keep the grazing group the same, but as long as you select your lambs at the outset randomly, you can select random lambs for the post-treatment samples as well.
So if you were pulling out, pulling out a smaller group, then a bit like you suggested earlier, so your poor doers or whatever, which you think might have a lower one, if you're struggling to get a high one, can you take them out at the same time as you start the wormer treatment check and then just run them together until you do the second one?
Yes, you can, as long as you mark them. You'll need to mark them then, so obviously you can find the same lambs. But you basically have a group within a group.
But don't take them out from the group. Leave them in the same group.
Well, you can take them out and then there will be a totally separate group, but you don't need to take them out. You can have a group within a group, as long as you're then sampling 15 random from the 20 that you've marked, then that is your sort of group within a group, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just do you remember that those pictures we saw earlier on in terms of what it is we're actually trying to measure? It's what's left inside those animals after treatment. So and it's what they started at and what they finish at. So it's just making sure that it's apples and apples, not apples and pears, basically.
Yeah. So once we get the post-treatment samples, we'll process them in the same way. And again, you'll get an egg count in a lab report. So you can see in this one, you've got 2 sets of counts. One is the ones that you got initially, and one set is your post-treatment. And all the information from the submission form again is carried over into the report. But you'll also have on here what the % reduction is based on the difference between the sampling at the outset and the sampling post-treatment. And it's this information and all the information that's about your worming treatment process that feeds into the next document, which is an extra bit, which is something which has been developed. It's come out of a previous project, but we've agreed to use it for Pathway because it's a much easier way to communicate these things and discuss them with farmers. So there you have it. So that's basically the lab report that you'll get. That includes pre and post treatment samples and your counts. And then the next one is this results report form. And this came out of a big EU project where the farmers who were in the project provided feedback to say they really liked the way the egg counts were presented. So instead of it just being dry lab report full of text and a few numbers, having them presented in a graph and with these heat maps, they found a much better way of visualising the results. And it's also a really good resource to use to discuss between vets and advisors and farmers, because what we don't really want to happen is that farmers only expect a count and the vets and advisors only provide a count. Really, it's what that count means and what happens next, which is important to get the most out of the testing. So you'll see on here, you've got some information in terms of what drug they've used. You've got the dates that they collected them and the dates they were processed. This one you can see must have got stuck in the post for a few days, and you've got the number sampled, and you've got the egg counts before and after treatment. So for Nematodyrus, you've got a reduction of 100% there. They used a white drench, so I guess we would expect that to work in Nematodyrus. And for your Trichostrongal type, you've got a count there which has come down, as you can see in the grey bars on that graph there. It's come down by 62.5%. So that puts you firmly in the orange band on that heat map there. And that's problematic. What we're talking about in terms of what we'd like to see is a reduction of more than 90%. If your reduction is more than 90%, we would interpret that as, well, everything's gone right and your drug's been effective in killing the worms that are in the sheep. If it's less than 90%, then we need to be looking at all of the aspects that make up your worming treatment, check that they went well, and if they were all done correctly, then that could be a judgment on the wormer itself. And that's why this second page goes through the top reasons for FEC inaccuracies and also the reliability checklist. And this won't be completed by the lab when they send this back to you. The aim is that this is something that farmers will sit down with their vet and advisor, and they will go through this, and then they will understand, okay, I did take a shortcut there, that's compromised my results, or, oh, okay, I should have done this differently, that's compromised my results. Or, and we know this happens quite often, because even though, we're always trying to make the point that worm egg counting is simple and straightforward, because we want everyone to be doing more of it. But even though it is straightforward, there's a lot that can go wrong and a lot of shortcuts that can be made which do compromise your final results. But the idea is that you go through this, everybody will be learning from it in terms of what they can do better. And if you've done everything correctly, then the count will be a reflection of the drug and whether the drug has been effective or not. So I think the next slide are a few examples of reports that we've had over the last few months.
Yeah, that's your next one.
So that's the next one, sorry. So this one, as you can see, is another one where they've used a white drench, and this was in early June. Again, you can see that there's 14 days between the date collected, and those samples were quick getting to the lab, 15 samples each time, which is good. No Nematodyrus eggs seen, so obviously it's not appropriate to talk about reduction there because there were no eggs seen, but you've only got a 32% reduction in your Trichostrongal type eggs. But, and it sometimes is added in here, or sometimes we leave it to you guys to go through the data. Though it was obvious from the information provided that on this occasion, the sheep had been dosed to the average in the group in terms of weight and not to the heaviest. So that's the sort of information that you can pick up, go through your reliability checklist, and then you'll know, how robust the result is. And I think the next one shows a one where the numbers look good. So a 92% reduction for your Trichostrongal types, 100% for your Nematodyrus, but a very low count to start with, 90 eggs per gram. And we would usually not be looking to do comparisons between counts unless the initial count was over 250. But we know that you may not be treating lambs at that level of a count either. So ideally, you want to have a count that's high enough to justify your treatment. And in this case, they were using an ivermectin drench. Sorry, moved on. And this one is another one. 15 days between sampling, again 100% reduction in the Nematodyrus count, and we've seen this quite a bit, so don't be surprised. You might be alarmed, but don't be surprised if you see this. It can happen that your egg count goes up where the wormer hasn't, or the worming treatment has not been effective, and then just a note that you need to check everything else.
Rebecca, could you just touch on a bit of timing, really? One in timing from sampling and posting it off, the importance of getting it away or putting it in the refrigerator, and also the importance of timing with I think that comes later, maybe with Leslie, on when to send the second testing. I think that comes later, but
when you're taking the samples, ideally don't take them on a day where they're going to get stuck in the post over the weekend. We've already mentioned expelling as much air as possible from the bags. That helps to keep the samples in the best condition as possible. And if there is going to be a delay, you can hold them in your fridge for a day or two over a weekend, rather than be at ambient temperature in the post. And all of that means that when the samples reach the lab, they're most likely to be in the best possible condition for an egg count to be taken out and taken. So yeah, those are my main tips in terms of when to take the samples and how to dispatch them to the lab.
There's one or two questions coming in as well, Rebecca, and so someone's saying, should we test for worm resistance in 2-year-old pet wethers? I mean, yeah, the question there is that 2-year-old pet wethers shouldn't really be having much of a worm count. You know, at that age, their acquired immunity should be quite strong, and we wouldn't expect 2-year-old pet wethers to need treating. So number one, they shouldn't need dosing. Number two, you wouldn't have a high enough egg count. If you did get a high enough egg count in them, then you could do, but it's not an ideal world. It's unlikely that you get a sensible test out of those, I would have thought.
I would also say, do you actually know the egg count of your 2-year-old wethers?
Well, exactly. Yeah, yes, exactly. So I'm looking at some of the others. Someone else is asking, if I choose individual marked lambs to collect samples from within a mob of 300, how many lambs do I need to sample? The answer is 15. Because basically, the 15, as Rebecca says, they have to be random and randomly done, and then things work. So you would still need to pick, well, you could pick 15 however you wanted to, but you would still need to do 15 to get a really reliable result. So I'm afraid that's not a shortcut that we can really suggest.
Have we had the slide with the EPGs yet on individual lambs as well? Is that coming?
I know I didn't put that. I haven't put that one up. I can put that one in, Kevin. We had that one at lunchtime. Yeah,
there was a question from Jan Ledoux. He got in trouble because he put it in the chat, not the question. But he just said, if you do the sampling on the same lambs pre and post, do you see much difference between lambs in the reduction?
If you do a sample in the same lambs pre and post.
Pre and post. So if you mark them like you can do sometimes on a more complex test, do you see much difference between the lambs in the reduction? So is the reduction?
Well, you will see a big difference between the individual lambs in terms of their initial EPG, and there will be some difference because obviously, you know, it's a biological system, but there will be a big difference in the actual numbers between those lambs. Do you want me to put that slide up, Kevin?
Well, if you can find it, that would be.
I can find it. Yeah.
What's happening at the lab is that the samples are being pooled at the lab. So at the lab, we're not doing counts on individual samples. At the lab, an equal volume, an equal weight of dung from each lamb is being taken and then homogenized really thoroughly to create a pool before we take a subsample out and do the count on that. And that's a process which it's quite time consuming to do all of the homogenization and so on. And it's possibly one of those things which is done less well when people are doing them in other places.
If Jan wanted to take the time and effort to mark the same lambs and separate them and test them, would he actually get a better result for the test? So if he tested the same 15 lambs the second time as the first time, I know we don't have to do it for the worm treatment check, but would he actually get a better result?
I think the science has shown that no, not really, which is why we've gone with 15 and said that you can do them randomly. But it's the random bit is really important because human nature, we tend to pick out the ones with the dirty tails, or we pick out the ones which are the poorer doing lambs, but they might not be the same ones after you've treated them. So doing it randomly is really important in terms of being able to do 15 random ones pre and post is critical. Yeah, I know it's really easy to pick out, to bias it in that way and end up picking dirty-tailed lambs at the beginning. Different lambs afterwards.
And people do that all the time, don't they? Because they think dirty tails is worms. And actually, if they've got dirty tails because they've perhaps got a nutritional scour or something else going on, you can get a very false low reading because obviously everything's coming out the back end a lot quicker. So the eggs aren't getting concentrated into dung that they would be if the dung was forming properly. So you've really got to be very careful. So, I mean, I've just put this slide up folks, because this is a group of 200 lambs where some poor person went through and did 200 individual samples and came up with the bar charts. And you can see for the group average is around about 200. I think it's just slightly over 200 if you do the maths. But you can see the range there. You know, you've got a few odd animals at the top there with a very high count, and you've got animals down the bottom there with much lower counts. So if you're going to sample a mob, you've really got to do it randomly. And 15, the statistics work, the science works, and it works really, really well. But if you try to preempt it, the chances of you preempting it and increasing the accuracy are not good. The chances of you decreasing the accuracy are very high indeed. But this really makes the point as well that Kevin was and Rebecca were making earlier, that if you're struggling with the EPG, what you could do is perhaps take out some of the bottom end lambs and resample those as a mob, and you might be able to get that group average up to something where you could actually treat that group and get your EPG high enough for the reduction test. Okay, I will go back to where I was.
I'm going to put off track.
No, it's fine. That's fine. So I think actually we probably want that one next, don't we, Rebecca?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we you know, the next question is what next, really. So you get that set of results, and I think, Rebecca, you know, you've explained really well how much information there is in one of those reports, because and we've spent a lot of time, haven't we, or you particularly, producing those reports to make it so that it's worthwhile. So you get something really useful out of it, and a really useful conversation, slightly wider around wormers and wormer treatments. But what next is, well, you continue, because it's just one test. So the worming treatment check or the Scottish system, when it comes online, that is just one snapshot in time. So what you're looking at then is one wormer group, only one wormer group within that test, and at one time of year. And we know that you need to test different groups. You need to test all of the groups as and when you use them to make sure they're working effectively for you. But you also need to think about doing some testing at different times of year. And what this slide just shows you is how over the year the predominant worm types change, and their levels of resistance to the different drug groups is also different. So very often, you know, we will find, and we've got Nematodiris there, we've talked about that a little bit, and you can see there it's predominant in the spring. That's not the main target for this type of test at this stage. But again, you know, if you were going to go in the spring, your chances of getting a test which really reflects the main strong isles is not great, as we've said. But then we've got Telosagia, what we used to call Osteotargia in old terms, and that's more predominant in the late spring and summer. So if we're testing now, then the chances are that the result that we're getting is more reflective of Osteotargia than later on in the autumn. The black scour worm, the Trichostrongylus, is more predominant. I certainly, and Rebecca, you see this all the time as well, you get quite a different result with the same wormer group between a test now and a test in the autumn. And that's not bad news, that's good news, because actually what it means is you can start to build up a picture of which wormer groups work best on your farm at different times of year. And so, you know, people say, oh, you know, triple resistance, multiple resistance, it's a massive disaster. It's not easy, but in most cases, people might have picked up some resistance to 2 or more of the groups. The chances are that 2 or more of them are working at different times. And with your vet, your advisor, you know, this is where, you know, you take these results to your vet, you take them to your SQP to discuss them, and you can talk more widely about the different groups. Rebecca, I don't know whether you want to add to that, you know, because I think it's important that people realise this isn't just a one-off thing. This is a something that, you know, you build a picture over time, don't you? And
exactly. So what we're saying is, you know, no knee-jerk reactions based on the results that you get in the worming treatment check. The conversation that you have once you get your results is almost certainly going to lead on to, well, let's do some more testing. And the more testing you do within your flock, the better worm control plan you can have for your flock, a much more bespoke plan for your flock based on what drugs are working at different times of year, because the different populations of worms that are present are different at different times of the year. So yeah, that's really important.
There's been a little bit of chat about microscopes, McMasters, and obviously you've got FECPAC and things like that. And these actual kits and the labs have been born out of the animal health pathway and getting that extra accuracy. Can you just explain where that bit more accuracy comes from? And then there's still a place for the McMaster slides and the FECPACs to help monitor things, and then maybe use the worm treatment check if you suddenly see you've got a little problem and you want more of an accurate result.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's, the more testing that people do in their flocks, the better. And whether that's farmers doing their own, whether that's SQPs or vets doing it in-house, that's absolutely fine. I think you do need to have confidence in the process and the protocol that's being followed. And the reason that DEFRA went down the route of having approved labs is because we can obviously control that. So DEFRA could stipulate that these labs had to prove that they were part of an externally assessed quality assurance scheme, so that they could prove that the staff at the labs are competent in doing the protocol, that they are identifying the right eggs as the right things, and that the counts that they're getting are standard compared to samples that are sent around to all the labs that are part of it, to basically check that you're counting the right things, that you're getting the right count. And the protocol that was followed is one which we were following a protocol similar, but we did tweak it slightly to improve it a little bit so that it met the high standards that are needed for the pathway. And the decisions on that were made by a group which didn't just include DEFRA, it included Sheep Vet Society, SCOPS, leading parasitologists, all sat down over many, many hours of meetings and thrashed out what protocol should we be doing for this, and how would we make sure that it was as standard as possible. Because what we're aiming to do with the worming treatment check, as you'll really understand from what we've gone through, is standardize everything. So from the sampling through the information that we gather on the submission forms, to the process at each of the labs, to the way they're reported, we're trying to standardize as much as possible so that if everything's done correctly, the count that you're getting is a robust result that's telling you about the effectiveness of the wormer. Whereas we know that there are different methods out there, and I'm not going to say that that no method is as good as what we're using for pathway, because that's not true. There will be a lot of people doing egg counts very well indeed, but they wanted to standardize everything as much as they could for pathway, and so that's why they went down the route of having these approved labs.
And the kits have been really designed to help people that, you know, make it simple for them, so they can just put the poos in its individual bags and send it off. Yeah. So it's a great toe in the water for people that haven't done it as well, isn't it? So
yeah,
exactly. I mean, but there's a lot that people can learn in terms of their own in-house testing. So, you know, if people wanted to take the example of the heat maps and the graphs and the results report form, and, you know, take that and use it for their own in-house testing, brilliant, you know, use it there. If it upskills and improves the engagement between vets and sheep farmers and advisors to talk about worm control, then that's brilliant. So I think if it can do that, then all to the good.
And some people are actually using it as a quality control for themselves, aren't they, Rebecca? You know, some people are saying, well, actually, you know, we're going to do this and we're doing our own FEC counting, but, you know, we'll split samples, you know, we have enough for each, but we can actually then test ourselves. I mean, somebody in the question, Nick is asking how accurate are pooled samples when the farmer has pulled the samples herself. The answer is it can be quite accurate if you do it properly. The problem is that, you know, you can't just pull 20 grams from one animal and 5 grams from another. So what this standard operating procedure does within the labs is it's very carefully weighed out amount from each one, so that you saw that spread of eggs per gram between that group of 200 lambs. So you can just imagine how it would skew things if you got a really big wodge of poo from the lamb with the 800 nod and a tiny bit from the one with 80, and you put them together, you've already so your pooling can be accurate and plenty accurate enough to do the monitoring work within your own flock, but you do just still need to bear in mind that variation and the fact that you need to not let one lamb dominate things, so to speak.
And that's where we're having quite a few vet practices that I've had conversations with recently, where, you know, it's really been a good starter to talk about people's protocols for doing egg counts in vet practices has been most of my conversations. And the vets have been quite keen to improve them and also to appreciate the limitations of what they're doing. So some of them have come to the conclusion that they feel happy doing counts in either groups of lambs where there are scouring lambs, because they know that their test is good enough for that. And they're happy doing monitoring ones where they're pre-pooling using approximately equal volumes from each animal and sufficient from each animal. But where they're going to do something where they really need to find out if a worm has been effective or not, they send those to us at the lab. So there are different ways of doing it.
Okay, I've moved on to the summary slide because I thought,
yes.
you know, then perhaps I can get rid of the slides and see if there's any more questions. But we just thought we'd put this summary slide up towards the end. Just, I think, really to say, when Rebecca and I were talking about this, that, you know, there's quite a lot involved in this, but don't let it put you off, because yes, there are the kits, yes, there are the forms, but they've been designed to actually make it as easy as we possibly can. If you just work your way through that, think about it, think about what it is you're trying to measure, and that will help you, you know, go through the, well, yeah, I do need to do this, and I do need to do it properly. You will get, you know, there's sorts of results that you see there with the heat map, which is really clear as to what that result is. And then on top of that, that discussion afterwards about, well, just how much store am I going to be able to put in these results? Did I really do it as well as I could have done? And then what next? What am I going to test next? What does that mean for me in terms of my worm control for the future? So, you know, we do hope that we've sort of explained it. It's not complex, but we have had to go into quite a lot of detail to make sure that when you do this, you get something really worthwhile out of it, and not just a few numbers on a bit of paper. Then you think, well, hang on a minute, what do I do with this? We really are trying desperately to avoid that. We want you to get a lot out of it.
Oh, we're doing for questions, Kevin.
There's one or two, I think there's one or two that we haven't perhaps covered.
It's slightly off piece, but they're worth answering if you know, people want to know the answer, and we've got you two clever people here.
So Jan's been on again. Hi, Jan. And really good question. And Rebecca, this is yours. You know, the pooling process and the different DM dry matter of the poo. How do you cope with that in the lab? What's the?
Yeah, it's more relevant where you're dealing with samples from scouring lambs, because obviously they're very runny. Where we're doing samples that are monitoring, so these are not scouring lambs, actually, if they're on the same diet and they're on under the same management, the dry matter tends to be roughly similar. We don't measure dry matter, so but in terms of a visible assessment, if they're under the same management, then they seem to be much better. But we wouldn't want to be weighing out 3 grams of a liquid sample and then 3 grams of a well-formed pelleted sample and expecting those to be contributing to a pool. We might think in that stage, well, you know, if there's animals that are actually scouring and diarrheic, maybe they should be done as a separate group, really.
What about vet training? There's questions in there about, you know, what training the vets have had. Really, this whole test can really be done without, but I think you should consult with your vet beforehand and then talk to your vet about the results. But how ready are the vets for it, and how much involvement should there be with them? Yeah,
so we know that most practices will have a vet within there who's keen on sheep. You might not even know which vet that is. So if you're going to speak to your practice, ask to have the vet that's keen on sheep doing your vet review visit, because they're the ones who are going to be the most clued up in terms of giving you advice. There's some really good sheep vets out there who do a lot of sheep work, but it is the case that there are also mixed practices where sheep might be a minority species in terms of the amount of work they do. but there's usually a vet within a practice who's keen on sheep. So I would always say ask for the sheep keen vet. They're the ones who are going to know the most. In terms of training for pathway, there's lots of resources that DEFRA have produced and are continuing to produce as well, geared at vets. And I know Sheep Vet Society, myself and Flock Health Limited did a series of workshops last year on pathway, engaging with your sheep clients, the worming treatment check, which again was well before pathway launched. And again, we've done similar things at the Sheep Vet Society conferences, which are aimed at vets as well. So asking for a vet who feels that they're well clued up on it is the best thing to do.
I mean, I think equally, don't be frightened to get yourself genned up, and you know, and have the worming treatment booklet and have that conversation really. Between the two of you,
fobbed off with just numbers. You know, a bunch of numbers is not what you should be getting out of this. You should be getting a discussion, because that's what the funding for pathway is intended to pay for. It's intended to pay for, you know, your vet visit, to include the testing and time to discuss your test results. So, you know, make sure that discussion's happening, because that's a really key part of it. No one should be being fobbed off with just some numbers.
There's great benefits from having your vet involved all year round, and you know, and hopefully if you can justify it being part of an annual health visit scheme with your vet, so that dialogue goes on all the way through the year, and you're not just ringing up and saying, I want to do a worm treatment check, or I need to do an animal health pathway. So it all comes together.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's easy to forget. I mean, tonight, obviously, we, in the time available, we didn't want to spend time persuading you it was a good idea to do a test, because you're on here tonight. We hope that you're on here because you think it's a good idea. But, you know, it's easy to forget that having done that and then starting to use wormers, which when you need one that are effective, you should see some real benefits in that, you know, and that means, again, talking about maybe doing some growth rate monitoring and just having a look at the benefits that you are getting, because it, you know, maybe, you know, we've seen it many times, you know, someone has been using wormer resistance. Doesn't happen overnight. It's an insidious process. It happens over a long period of time, and just gradually those little red worms that we were talking about earlier on become more and more and more in a bigger proportion of the population, and you get less and less benefit every time you do a worming. So, you know, you should be, you know, thinking about this in terms of real live benefits in terms of lamb performance.
But do one more question.
And obviously that's why it was identified by DEFRA as the priority for the pathway visits, is because it is such a significant thing in the sheep sector, and such an expensive thing to have within your flocks if you do have resistance.
But do one more question, because time is pushing on and everyone's been quite patient and staying with us. And so it's not really English centric pathway. Caroline's asked, a Scottish scheme is asking to select poor looking animals to sample. This isn't random. So is their scheme badly thought out?
I can tell you what I know of the Scottish scheme. So the Scottish scheme is, the Scottish Government is funding a scheme called Preparing for Sustainable Farming. It's a 2-year scheme for this year and next year. And there's, for cattle and sheep, there's 9 what they're calling incentives, 4 for cattle, 5 for sheep, and one of them is sheep roundworms. And it does specify that what you're wanting to look at is to do a drench check test or a fecal egg count reduction test. It isn't as prescriptive as pathway in terms of how you do that. I haven't read anywhere where it's said to select the poorest looking animals in the information that I've read on that, to be honest, but I'm not doubting that it's out there if that's what you've read. But my advice, and the links that are provided by Scottish Government tend to be to the Morden resources, and obviously Morden is well respected and lots of excellent parasitology work happening there. And so generally I would be saying random samples is the way to go. They're very different schemes, the pathway scheme and the Scottish scheme, and there will be a similar scheme in Wales coming soon. So they're very different schemes, but it's hard to say, you know, which is the best. Time might tell, but they are different.
Right. Nothing to add to that, Leslie?
No, not really. No, I mean, I've not read that either. It would, you know, having obviously what we've said tonight, there can be lots of reasons why lambs are poor doers. So, and it's not always worms, and scouring lambs, it's not always worms. It can be lots of other things. So I shall go and have a look.
Yeah. Listen, that's been great. Time's caught us up, and we've had some other great ideas in the questions there for other webinars as well, which we could do in the future. Leslie, Rebecca, thank you very much. That's 2 webinars today we've done. And for those who have been here today, I'm sure there'll be a recording of this put online somewhere at some stage. So if there's anything you missed or a recap, then feel free to watch it back at your heart's delight. But again, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.